Nighttime sharpens, brightens each.
What happens when the one thing that defines you is suddenly at risk of vanishing forever? For Anthony Warlow, Australia's most celebrated operatic voice, that terrifying question wasn't hypothetical. It was real, urgent, and life-altering. At the height of his fame, when his voice echoed through the grandest theaters and captured hearts worldwide, a silent threat emerged, not from critics or rivals, but from within his own body. In 1999, the world watched in confusion as Warlow mysteriously stepped away from the spotlight. No scandals, no controversy, just silence. The truth, kept away from headlines at the time, was devastating. Warlow had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer that not only threatened his life, but could take away his voice forever. The voice that had earned him standing ovations at the Sydney Opera House, the voice that transformed him into the phantom behind the mask, was now in jeopardy. Yet, Warlow never played the role of the victim. What followed was not a press-covered breakdown or a farewell tour. It was something quieter and more powerful. Behind closed doors, he fought for his life, for his breath, and for each note he feared he might never sing again. But how does an artist rebuild not just his voice, but his identity, after facing the silence of death itself? And why did so few ever hear the full story? In this video, we uncover the emotional odyssey behind Anthony Warlow's battle, not just with cancer, but with the terrifying possibility of losing what made him legendary. This isn't a story of scandal. It's the haunting silence that almost stole a voice, and the refusal to let it win. Anthony Warlow was never just a singer. He was a force of theatrical nature. Born in 1961 in Wollongong, New South Wales, his presence on stage radiated something few performers could muster: command, vulnerability, and a vocal precision that defied comparison. As a baritone with a rich timbre and extraordinary range, Warlow became Australia's musical theatre crown jewel, mastering both operatic repertoire and Broadway classics with equal brilliance. By the early 1990s, Warlow was a household name in Australia, adored by purists and casual theatergoers alike. His defining role as the Phantom in The Phantom of the Opera had elevated him to international acclaim, and his performances in Les Miserables, The Secret Garden, and Jekyll and Hyde showed an uncanny ability to disappear into characters, troubled, haunted, noble, grotesque, with flawless execution. He wasn't just performing roles, he became them. Critics often compared his vocal prowess to that of American baritone Thomas Hampson, but with something uniquely Australian, a raw emotional honesty that cut through even the most bombastic orchestration. Warlow's reputation was spotless. There were no tabloid controversies, no showbiz feuds, no missteps. He was, in every sense, the model artist. But that perfect image hid a quieter story, one that had yet to be told. Beneath the stage makeup and velvet costumes was a man carrying a secret weight. In the late 90s, while audiences applauded his performances night after night, Warlow began to experience an unfamiliar fatigue. Initially dismissed as stress or overwork, natural for someone maintaining grueling tour schedules and demanding vocal roles, the signs grew more concerning. He was losing stamina. The notes he once reached with effortless grace became harder to hold. Something was wrong. Then came the diagnosis: non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a type of cancer that targets the lymphatic system, had taken root. In the world of opera and theater, where breath control, lung capacity, and vocal power are everything, this wasn't just an illness. It was an existential threat. To the public, his absence was confusing. He vanished without explanation. Rumors swirled: burnout, creative exhaustion, even early retirement. But few knew the real reason, and even fewer understood the devastating implication: that Anthony Warlow, Australia's greatest voice, might never sing again. In an industry that thrives on exposure, Warlow chose silence. No interviews, no drama, no televised tears. Just retreat. And therein lies the haunting intrigue of his story, not in the scandal of what was said, but in the power of what wasn't. What followed was not a fall from grace, but a slow, private descent into uncertainty. He underwent chemotherapy. He faced physical changes that threatened his vocal technique. He confronted the terrifying prospect that his instrument, his voice, might be permanently damaged. Yet through it all, he planned not a farewell, but a return. This video doesn't just explore the man behind the voice, it investigates the unseen war he fought to reclaim it. A story not of ego or spectacle, but of quiet resilience, of a star who refused to let illness rewrite his final act, and of a voice the world nearly lost forever. Anthony Warlow's journey to theatrical immortality didn't begin in marble halls or grand stages. It began modestly, with a gifted young boy in Wollongong whose voice stood out even among seasoned adults. He was the kind of talent that didn't just sing notes, he shaped them. As a teenager, Warlow trained classically, immersing himself in opera, but always keeping a quiet affinity for musical theater. His dual fluency in both worlds would later become his signature. In 1985, Warlow made his operatic debut with the Australian Opera, and soon after, he appeared in The Pirates of Penzance, a performance that instantly captured national attention. But it was his transition into musical theater that truly ignited his legend. Roles like Sky Masterson in Guys and Dolls, Archibald Craven in The Secret Garden, and most notably, Enjolras in Les Miserables revealed a performer capable of emotional depth and vocal strength few could rival. The 1990s cemented his place in Australian cultural history. His casting as the Phantom in The Phantom of the Opera was not only a triumph, it was transformative. Warlow brought tortured nobility to the role, turning a disfigured recluse into a tragic romantic figure. Audiences were left breathless, critics effusive. Some called it the definitive Phantom. Box office numbers soared. The stage was his cathedral, and his voice was the sermon. But no ascent is without friction. The demands on Warlow's voice were brutal. 8 shows a week, sometimes twice a day. Add to that the pressure to remain flawless, always pitch perfect, always emotionally present. Privately, he spoke of the physical toll, strained muscles, vocal fatigue, exhaustion masked by makeup and applause. He kept going, believing, as many performers do, that stopping meant fading. Then, somewhere between curtain calls and rehearsals, the first symptoms crept in. He felt drained after shows. His energy waned. Rehearsals became a slog. Some nights, he had to push through with sheer will. But still, he delivered. Because that's what legends do. In 1999, while preparing for another major production, the unthinkable happened. He was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. To the public, it was barely a whisper. But to Warlow, it was a full stop. Cancer wasn't just a medical condition. It was a dismantling of everything he had built. His body, the very engine of his gift, was turning against him. Treatment began almost immediately. Chemotherapy, isolation, weakness. For someone whose power came from breath, strength, control. It was a brutal stripping away of identity. At one point, he confided that he wasn't sure if his voice would ever return. Not just because of physical damage, but because something inside him, his center, had shifted. Where once there was confidence, now there was doubt. Yet, even then, Warlow refused to mourn the career he feared he'd lost. Instead, he disappeared from public view and focused on healing, not just to survive, but to reclaim his voice. He didn't announce his illness, didn't ask for sympathy, didn't stage a comeback narrative. He simply waited and worked. Years passed, quietly. Most assumed he had retired. Some whispered about his health. But then, like something out of myth, Anthony Warlow reemerged. Not diminished, but transformed. He returned to the role of the Phantom with a performance that critics called deeper, more fragile, more human. It wasn't just a comeback, it was a resurrection. His voice carried a different kind of strength now. Not just technical precision, but emotional gravity. The sound of someone who had faced silence and chosen to sing anyway. The audience didn't know it then, but every note they heard had nearly been stolen by cancer. Every breath was hard-won. And behind the velvet curtain, the man who once doubted he'd ever perform again stood where he always belonged, center stage. The truth behind Anthony Warlow's silence during his illness isn't dramatic in the conventional sense, but it is devastating in its quiet dignity. He never sought headlines, never issued public statements. At a time when celebrity confessions were currency, Warlow refused to commodify his suffering. And yet, within that silence was the deepest expression of vulnerability. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is not a disease that grants its victims predictability. Chemotherapy ravages the immune system, shreds muscle mass, and weakens the lungs, everything a singer depends upon. While fans speculated about burnout or retirement, Warlow was alone in hospital rooms, enduring rounds of treatment that threatened his life and his legacy in equal measure. The man who once held audiences in awe with his breath control was now gasping to make it through a single sentence. Privately, he worked with vocal therapists, unsure if his tone would ever return, unsure if he'd ever hit a clean note again. One close associate later shared that Warlow would stand in front of a mirror, whispering arias, tears in his eyes, not because the music was gone, but because it was there, and he could no longer reach it. He wasn't fighting to stay famous. He was fighting to stay himself. There are no dramatic quotes, no explosive confessions. But perhaps what's more powerful is what Warlow didn't say. He let his silence speak. And when he returned, it was without fanfare, without interviews, without headlines. Just a man, stepping into the Phantom's mask once more, carrying with him the invisible weight of everything he'd survived. Audiences didn't know what had been taken from him. They only saw a Phantom with eyes that burned deeper, a voice that trembled not from weakness, but from truth. Critics were stunned. One review simply read, "Warlow doesn't perform, he bleeds." Behind the scenes, producers whispered about how close they came to recasting the role. One revealed that they had a shortlist ready, just in case he couldn't return. But when Warlow walked into the rehearsal room, frail but upright, they watched a man defy medical logic. It wasn't just the Phantom of the Opera that Warlow returned to. He later reprised Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a role that mirrored his own duality, the respected public figure and the private man fighting monstrous uncertainty. These performances, post-recovery, were no longer just entertainment. They became confessions wrapped in song. The public's reaction was subtle at first. Warlow had never been the tabloid darling, but among the theater faithful, a quiet reverence grew. He became something more than a performer. He became a symbol, not just of talent, but of resilience. The Australian media began referring to him not only as Australia's finest voice, but as its quiet warrior. Fans who had watched him in the 90s returned with tears in their eyes, hearing the same notes, but now, every note felt heavier. One theatergoer was quoted saying, "I used to love his voice. Now I understand it." There is no footage of Warlow breaking down, no memoir filled with accusations, just a body of work that, after cancer, spoke with even more pain, more gratitude, more life. The dark truth of Anthony Warlow is this, that while he was the Phantom, while he was Enjolras, while he was Jekyll and Hyde, he was also a man who nearly lost everything and never once asked for pity. And maybe that's why his story remains buried in whispers. Because real pain doesn't scream, it echoes in the silence between each song. Anthony Warlow's story isn't the kind that fits neatly into today's media narratives. There are no scandals to dissect, no explosive interviews, no betrayals or backstage rivalries. And yet, what makes his journey so compelling, so unforgettable, is exactly that. In a world that often confuses volume with value, Warlow chose the power of restraint. He didn't survive just for the stage. He survived for the art. As a channel that explores legends and their secrets, we often dive into the dramatic, controversies, feuds, shattered images. But with Warlow, the secret isn't a dirty one. It's a quiet one. It's the kind of truth the world tends to overlook because it doesn't scream for attention. It whispers. And if you're listening closely, it breaks your heart. We believe Warlow represents something rare, a performer whose greatest act was not on stage, but behind the curtain. While many chase legacy through exposure, he built his legacy through endurance. Not the kind that demands applause, but the kind that earns silent respect. To step back into the Phantom of the Opera after a war with cancer is not just professional, it's deeply human. Every line, every breath post-recovery was an act of defiance against oblivion. In many ways, his decision to remain silent about his illness while facing it speaks louder than any headline. It shows a discipline, a humility, and a sense of sacredness toward the stage that is almost extinct in modern fame. He didn't want to manipulate public sympathy. He didn't sell his pain. He let the performance tell the story. That kind of integrity is, frankly, rare. And it raises a difficult question. How many other legends have quietly suffered, rewritten their identities in silence, and returned with no fanfare, only to be passed over in favor of louder, more scandalous voices? Perhaps we, as an audience, need to learn to hear what isn't shouted, to feel what isn't posted. Warlow's career didn't just survive cancer, it absorbed it, metabolized it, and came out richer. His voice may have returned with a tremble, but it was the tremble of a man who had lived, not just performed. And that is why this story deserves to be told. Not because it's loud, but because it's real. It reminds us that legends aren't always forged in flames. Sometimes they're rebuilt in silence. Now we'd like to hear from you. Do you remember the first time you heard Anthony Warlow sing? Did you ever notice something different in his voice after his return? And more importantly, do you think true greatness requires survival through suffering? Let us know. Your perspective is part of this legacy too. Some voices fade with time, others are lost to tragedy, swallowed by the pace of an unforgiving industry. But Anthony Warlow's voice, though nearly silenced by fate, endured, and in its endurance, it changed. It became deeper, not in pitch, but in meaning. Each note he sang after cancer wasn't just music, it was memory, pain, gratitude, life. It's strange to think that one of Australia's most treasured performers nearly vanished without warning. No curtain call, no public goodbye, just a quiet disappearance into the shadows of illness. And yet, he emerged again, not as the same man, but as something stronger, more fragile, more human. And in that humanity, he became timeless. Today, many remember his phantom. Fewer remember the gap between performances, the invisible war waged in hospital rooms and silent mornings. Fewer still understand what it means to return from that abyss and reclaim your purpose, knowing that it could be taken away again at any moment. But now you do. Because this isn't just the story of Anthony Warlow, the performer. It's the story of Anthony Warlow, the survivor, the artist who chose resilience over recognition, substance over spectacle. In an era where confession is currency and pain is often paraded, he gave us something different, a legacy built not on exposure, but endurance. There is no need for a final act when the work speaks for itself. And Warlow's work, layered with history, haunted by mortality, lifted by grace, still speaks. Some stories are never told, but now you know.